Welcome to the webinar on cybersecurity in the current crisis, a new wake-up call for board members. The pandemic is transforming the way we work, the way we interact as today, and the way we conduct transactions. And many of those trends will be lasting beyond the current crisis. At the same time, we experience and observe an increasing number of attacks on networks and systems, and as well on the sophistication levels of those attacks, which is increasing. So it's probably safe to say that the topic of cybersecurity and its strategic implications has finally arrived at the board level. So how to conduct decisive and meaningful discussions on cybersecurity at the board level and how to take the right decisions at that level. These will be topics we're going to discuss in today's webinar with a group of very experienced leaders in the area of cybersecurity. So we're very glad to welcome today Troels Ørting. He is the head of the Global Center for Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forums. He has more than 40 years experience in cybersecurity, both in the private sector as well as public sector. So working as a CSIO for Barclays Group or working for Europol. Also very glad to welcome Klara. She is the Executive Director for Europe and Africa for the Global Cyber Alliance. And she has been working with many companies and organizations in fostering the understanding and the policies towards cyber security, both for profit and not for profit organizations, which we'll share more about it in today's discussion. Then we are very glad to have Caroline Dietmeier here as well, a distinguished board member of a number of companies and very famous brands, such as Ferrero, Illy Coffee, Generali, Montclair, or Alpha Bank. Besides that, he's also an author and a lecturer on the topic of risk governance. And finally, very glad to have Sebastian Hess among us. He as well has a very rich experience in cybersecurity, currently working in the cybersecurity team of AIG, advising global leading companies on how to safeguard against those threats. And he also has a lot of experience in the public sector as well, the public sector, such as being the CSIO of the ISAF NATO forces in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. Now, most importantly, are your questions, your thoughts, your comments. Please feel free to post your questions or add your comments in the Q&A section on the bottom of the screen. And we look forward to bringing up those questions as we speak, and also have reserved 10 minutes at the end to take on some other questions you might have about the topic. In April this year, a group of 3 parties, which is ecoDa, the Global Cyber Alliance, and AIG, published the guidelines on cyber risk oversight. It was intended to provide 5 principles which shall help board members to address and tackle the issue of cybersecurity at the board level. And we will use those principles to structure today's discussion. First, we'll talk about what are the mindsets needed at the board level in the organization to take the right perspective on cybersecurity. We then will look more into the capability question. So how to make sure that members in the board, the executive team, but as well the organization has the right skills and right capabilities to deal effectively with the topic. And finally, in the third part, we're going to look at how to make it happen, how to overcome some of the very common hurdles in execution, those principles and policies. So with that, I would like to start right away and with our first topic, the mindset challenge in cybersecurity. And for that, I'd like to hand over to Caroline. You're, as I said before, a member of many boards and audit committees. So you have seen a lot, and you have seen it for many years, those topics coming up at the board level. What do you think are the key challenges and how to overcome them when it comes to the mindset about cybersecurity?
Thank you. The biggest challenge is, in fact, the mindset. I have been following for years cyber risk at the board level, and what I have observed is shock from the incident, fear of the unknown about the incident, reaction from that shock and fear. And what is that? That's not governance. That is pure reaction management. So the mindset is bring it to a governance level. And in fact, the first principle of the ecoDa guidance addresses exactly that. You have to approach cyber as an enterprise risk management issue, a strategy issue, and not an IT issue. The whole idea is get away from the fragmented approach, the piecemeal approach, the backward-looking approach, bring it to enterprise risk management. So having said that, you have to take a business perspective. Sounds easy, but we'll try to get into examples, not an IT view. And if I may say, we have to start shifting from looking at events to looking at assets, at digital assets, and how important each of our digital assets are, knowing where the most important assets are and prioritizing them. And having said that, it's not an IT issue, in any case, we have our Chief Information Officer and our Chief Information Security Officer that need to take on a similar mindset the board needs to have. In other words, strategy, prioritization, cost-benefit approach, and so forth. And that is a challenge as well, because they are used to a different mindset. In the ecoDa guidance, there is a very interesting list of most valuable information to cyber criminals. It goes from customer information, financial information, strategic plans, and you can well imagine that. It goes to employee information, customer passwords, and that's typical. But which are the most important to the business, to your business? Not one size fits all is a common term in Europe. That's the term we want. R&D information, intellectual property, M&A information, whole different world that may or may not be important to a business. So it all has to be very personalized. So having said that, and having said that the mindset must be forward-looking, enterprise risk management looking based on principle 1 of this guidance, I say that the starting point is to have a comprehensive assessment of the area of cyber. And the guidance provides ways to do that. Hopefully we'll be getting into that a little bit more, but governance, prevention, monitoring, response is all part of enterprise risk management. So it fits right in, cyber fits right in perfectly. And once you do that, you can say, okay, I know where I am, where do I want to be? And that's where you get into, as the ecoDa guidance provides, maturity scale issues. Where do I stand? Where do I want to be? And let's not forget, how much budget can I get every year to get where I want to be? So there's a whole lot of dynamics. It's it's not theoretical. It's very practical, putting cyber into that risk management format.
Okay, thanks a lot, Caroline. And probably just hand over to Troels. You have been working now extensively with CEOs and CSIOs, in particular over the last couple of months in your role at the World Economic Forum. So what have been the mindset challenges you have encountered in that conversations?
I think what we have seen is that we have faced what we anticipate to be 3 years of a digital transformation taking place in 3 months, basically due to the pandemic. So we've moved 1.2 billion people from offices to working from home. We have spread the attack surface. We've done a lot of things to keep the wheels spinning. And that underlines the notion that board members need to take this extremely serious, because everything in the future will be connected. Everything will be also sensing. Everything will be stored and everything will be intelligent. So the digital transformation is not just something that you can not pay attention to. So regardless if you are a hardware company or you are a sausage factory or whatever, you are also a digital tech company where everything is online. So you cannot really escape from that. So board members need to take that serious. Also, as Caroline said, there needs to be a plan, basically from the top of the organization. I also think that we have only seen the tip of the iceberg. We predict in the World Economic Forum that the whole shift from laptops to mobile systems, where everybody will move from a computer to a portable device, where you will have everything done on tablets, will increase the internet population and the traffic and the demand for technical solutions, because you will go from 3.4 billion people online to almost 7 billion people online very, very fast. That will also fuel a lot of IoT devices, because now you have 5G, and 5G will then create the possibilities to have sensors all over. And again, that creates that everything is connected. So in the old days, as a company, I could look at my estate and say, I'll probably see if I can ring fence this a bit and have, rings of LED around it. But in this world, my vulnerability is your vulnerability, and your vulnerability is my vulnerability, because we are from supply chain and other ones also connected to each other. So I think this is what you have to have on your mind as a board member. And then, of course, I think the most important question and the most difficult to answer, and I'm not sure I'm also capable in all circumstances to answer it, is what does good look like? When is enough in cyber? When have we done enough? Have we overdone it? Have we underdone it? And I think that many board members are struggling with that questions. They are asking to the CISOs, tell me on a scale from 0 to 10, how safe are we today? And all of this. And that is something to do with risk appetite. And the CISO cannot set the risk appetite. That's a board decision to set the risk appetite. So that is another thing that the board needs to take on board, so to say, is to say, I am in a board for a bank. There might be a limited risk appetite. I'm in a board in another company. There might be a different one based on risk, the threat, the crown jewels, the money that you have available also for doing your job, and all of these things. And then the last thing I would say is to this question is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you don't embed security into your DNA in your organization, then you can do all the strategies you want in all colors. They will be received, they'll be looked at, they'll be thrown over the shoulder, and people will continue to do what they have always done, probably nothing. So you need the tone from the top is very, very important, and also the culture. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. I think a very, very important point to just make about the culture, but as well about the ability to benchmark and to see how we're doing in comparison to others. And in that respect, Klara, you have been working with many companies and not-for-profits. What is your experience? How to make sure people are open to share their experience, but still might be a little bit afraid to share too much? How to handle this conflict and trade-off?
Thank you. Yeah, it really goes regardless of the size or the sector of the organization. We've seen, I work with a lot of boards of not-for-profits, where the risk tolerance may be different, but really the main role, we say, kind of the number one is kind of setting the tone. I really do think the board must set and be the example of the organization's, values, risk culture, and expectations on the team. Because if they lead by example, it's a regular topic on the agenda of the board, it becomes a certain culture. I think very much, again, regardless for the sector or the size of the organizations, is it to set the impact tolerance, for any business risk or operational risks. Once we know what we can tolerate, then we can set a strategy. I'll also say that the important kind of in the pandemic context and what we are looking at, it's really the change into being more agile in addressing risk, and also perhaps even being more practical in helping organization in a supply chain to manage the risk. Because we know that one of the roles of the board is to understand the supply chain risk, what it brings to the organizations. Now we live in a time when, for most organizations, the supply chain is made of smaller organizations. During the pandemic, the individuals making up these organizations have lost the corporate shield of cybersecurity. So I actually do think that one of this changing roles is not only to set the expectations, but actually be a little more proactive as to what an organization can do for its supply chain. So we'll speak a little later about possible ways to address this issue. I'll make a very quick last point. It's something I really recommend for members and participants today to look at. You may very well remember the Target and Home Depot breaches that occurred, and they really made news. If you look at the differences, in the number of the credit cards, Target, it was 40 million. I think Home Depot was almost 60. I think Home Depot was a much bigger breach in terms of the consequences in terms of cybersecurity. But when it came to impact of the organization, Home Depot came out really well because the Target board and senior management really mismanaged the breach. They took 10 or 12 days to even notify the customers. Home Depot did it the next day. So if you ever have an opportunity to, there's a couple of really interesting podcasts that compare them, and it really came down to the board. There were so many board members who had no experience in cybersecurity, but actually they understand that this is a business risk, and they really, really the proactive role of the board. It did cost the company half of the amount of money that it cost the Target, even if that breach was smaller. So I would even say, there's a lot of good guidance, looking at a lot of good analysis being done of these breaches, and they do look at the role of the board, and they do look at the differences and what a huge difference it can make on that bottom line, or managing a certain reputational value of managing the risk. So I'll stop here. We'll talk more about the practical issues, but I think these are the three, 4 high-level points.
And it's definitely great, I think, to learn from such incidences, and see how it played out and what we can do better as a company. And I think you mentioned the topic risk, as Caroline did before. And Sebastian, now you work for a company whose business is dealing with risks, insurance company. So what is your experience on how board members perceive cyber risk as a risk in comparison to other risks they deal with every day?
My perception is that boards are really going through an evolution when it comes to cyber risks and their perception of it. And it kind of maps a bit the evolution that I've gone through myself. Whereas in the beginning, when we just look at, not too many decades ago, how this whole notion of the technology revolution kind of started with the invention of the internet. The focus really was on getting information from A to B in a very robust way, but there was no one really considered security at that point. And ever since then, we kind of built more on top of this basic fundament, making it more complex, making it more complicated. And we kind of increased the connectivity. We made it. We increased the interaction level, and we kind of started out really as an IT phenomena, looking at it, and it really also then meant that all security challenges, information security challenges, or cybersecurity challenges, by definition, were IT problems, and that was true for the longest time. But I think the military kind of got it right first. Not sure when it actually happened, but they came out and declared cyber as a domain in itself, where it says, well, this might be the domain one day that kind of rules all the other domains, the land domain, the sea domain, the space domain, and I'm missing one, the air domain. And the reason is quite simple, because cyber at its core has no territory and has the ability to reach out into all the other domains directly. And that's, from my perspective, something that we now see more and more being mapped into the business world, where there's a growing understanding of this concept of a cyber domain really taking foot. And what I mean by that is, of course, technology has a big factor when it comes to businesses, be it as an office tool, automation, you name it. And those, of course, are the traditional IT risks. But cyber then as a domain in its larger context really also touches a lot on reputational risk. And we just heard about Target versus Home Depot, for example. It also touches a lot about financial risks because cyber incidents really can have significant financial impacts, and we've certainly seen quite a few of those from an insurer's side. But it also looks at the way of how businesses go about doing their business. For example, what is the core of their value generation? Is data gathering, for example, and protecting that data at the core of their strategy? But then also more sinister things, like, for example, how does the competition look at cyber? How is espionage coming into this whole equation? So all those topics kind of have very, very important cyber aspects. So my evolution really was that I started out from an IT perspective. Now I really come to a conclusion. Yeah, cyber really is very much an enterprise component, an enterprise risk component, due to all those facets that it has.
And Sebastian, you just mentioned, I think, the pioneering role of the military in identifying, cyber as a future battlefield. I think another aspect of the military, which is very interesting, I think, where I think private sector can learn, is the aspect of training, of capability. Militaries, armies usually, train people for a long time to be ready when something happens. So what can business learn from the military when it comes to building the right capabilities when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, from my perspective, one of the things that still holds very true in my experience is the whole train as you fight notion. So you kind of really want to simulate real world events and see how your organization reacts. So in the business world, that of course means, for example, having tabletop exercises with your board, with your executive teams, to see how certain cyber crisis might unfold, how a ransomware attack might play out. And I've done recently one with a company in the UK, financial company, and they really had some great incident response plans. You could see that the team had worked together in the past and they know what they were doing. But once we played through one of the ransomware attacks, one of the things they kind of really completely overlooked was that they didn't consider the impact of all their systems being locked out, and therefore also their customer relation database being locked out. So they had, even though they wanted to do the right things, they wanted to communicate to their customers, to their clients, to their shareholders, they had no idea where they were because they couldn't get to the data. So things like that are really, really useful. And the closer you train and you exercise toward your real world environment, the more beneficial it is, I think. And that is true from the lower part of the organization all the way up to the board. Great.
Klara.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, and I keep raising my hand because I'm not sure how many people you see on the screen. So just to add to what Sebastian mentioned, and what you can learn from the military. I think there's another important point, which is that we just can. Every business is connected to geopolitical developments. Even if we are a small hair shop, there are repercussions of geopolitical developments on our cybersecurity or posture. Because if we know that there's a civil unrest in a country, or if we understand that a certain region is doing notoriously well economically, we can actually expect a spike in cybercrime coming from that region. If we know that two countries are having a dispute over diplomatic relations, we now, this is what Sebastian said, it's a domain of operation. We know that, nation states are using cyberspace as another tool of their, to achieve their national security and foreign policy goals. So you watch the news, you understand what is going on, and now it is a tool in any toolbox of a country. And again, you can kind of see the economical developments in certain regions, and there are then repercussions on cybersecurity. So it's really, as military does, they do consider everything in the context of geopolitics. I think it's important for any other business, to do that, because when it comes to cyber, again, there are going to be repercussions down the road.
Great. Troels, you would like to weigh in?
Yeah, I also picked up something I think that was important what Sebastian said from the military about tabletop exercises of board members. And just to give you a flavor of what we are doing in the Danish Board Association is that we have established what is called a cyber risk simulator. So we are actually now able to run whole boards through a real tabletop exercise with a number of dilemmas, with screens, with implication on stock, with social media, when they write about it, all of that puts the board under pressure. And like you said, Sebastian, do we pay or do we not pay? That is one of the critical things that you ask your board to. That could have implications on your standing or whatever. But to have this risk simulator has suddenly enabled the board to feel the pain themselves before they are hit by a real accident or attack. And I think the preparation is so important, because it's not a matter of if I'm going to be hacked, it's when you will be hacked, and when you will be hacked, how do you then, deal with it? And I think that is why these preparations are so important. Thank you.
Great. So definitely feeling the pain, I think that always helps to get awareness. Caroline, what is your experience? What are the key capabilities needed at the board level and organization level to deal effectively with cybersecurity?
So 4 points come to mind with the issue of capability. One has to do with organizational setup, actually, to enhance capability. Another has to do with board induction or information as far as understanding all the reputational and legal sides, and that in fact is principle 2 of the ecoDa handbook. Understanding reputational and legal implications. It's not a small issue, specific to the company always. Third point is the capability of the Audit Committee members and the Audit Committee as a whole as a support to the board. And fourth issue is the board members themselves. I would like to go through that risk simulator. The capability of asking questions. And there also is actually toolkit that the ecoDa provides, toolkit B for questions. So just hitting quickly on each of those, as far as organizational enhancement, taking on what we said before of a business approach, you need a cyber risk committee or team at management level, and it needs to be a mix of IT folks and business people, and that will enhance capabilities automatically. At the board level, I mentioned induction. The many legal areas that I say induction is the right way to go through it. GDPR we talk about all the time because it's very recent, but there's also the Payment Services Directive, the Public Company Disclosures, the NIS Directive, and so forth. You need to know about them, and knowing about them also will improve board minutes, which is also an issue on responsibility, and also the third-party risk issues. I think that it's even more complicated now with COVID because there are lots of requests from ESMA, from other areas, supervisors for disclosure. So the board has to think in a certain way. So they have to have capability, and they didn't know about that. As far as the Audit Committee goes, which is an area that I work a lot with, you need a strong Audit Committee. They need to be capable. Do they need an IT person in there? Nice to have, not an absolute must, nice to have. Not an absolute must, because it is possible to grasp that comprehensive assessment at a high level without being a technician. You need to look at the composition, therefore. ecoDa mentions in their paper, in their guidance, that today, 40% of the board counts upon itself to review cyber, which is surprising. It was very high. Whereas the Audit Committee is about 50% of the cases that provides a support, which I thought was a little low. the audit committee must spend a lot of time on cyber. I do. It's either quarterly or minimum twice a year. So in order to spend time, you have to think about what's your agenda, capability of formulating an agenda for the audit committee that ensures information then to the board. So again, the comprehensive assessment we talked about, maturity scale we talked about, but also selected metrics. Which metrics are the most important? And analyzing those incidents, just as it's always interesting to analyze incidents, whether external or internal, that will help you be sensitive. And again, the board questions, it's very extensive, the toolkit that ecoDa provides. And what's useful is you're certainly not going to go down the list and say, well, I should ask you all these questions. No, you get a feeling for the questions, and you, at any point in time in a board meeting, a strategy meeting, long-term planning meeting, or other meeting, a question might be perfect. And questions are all about challenge, and that's the role of the board member, is to provide challenge. So having that toolkit is quite useful. And for example, in the long list of possible questions, how was the budget determined around cyber? Great question. Great question. It'll end up in a long discussion.
Getting back to the budget topic, because that's at the end, in business, we all know that's key. Probably just, and I think the principles and toolkit you're just referring, developed by ecoDa and AIG, I think it's really useful. I think very comprehensive. I definitely can recommend everybody to take a look and go through the lists. The one question which just came in and probably linked to what you were referring to was the question, in the board, where should it be dealt with? In the audit committee, or actually should it be really discussed among all the board members? Or is it a danger of delegating it to the audit committee that all the other board members will just kind of ignore, it and not really take it up? Caroline.
Well, this is the art and science of governance. The amount of information that passes from a committee to the board level, it varies greatly between organizations. It's up to the audit committee chair, and this is my primary focus, to ensure that the board gets enough, to ensure that the audit committee examines it. Could be for hours if necessary, and the board has the right time to examine it. So there are so many different approaches. There are written reports, there's verbal reports by the chair, and some of the presentations, all of the presentations. It's really, I believe in extensive examination on the audit committee and lots of appropriate information to the board with a time restriction and efficiency view to it.
Yeah, Sebastian?
Yeah, I'd like to add that I really think that both have really a strong role in that discussion. Because from my experience, the audit committee oftentimes really comes toward the topic more from a compliance-driven mindset. So understanding more, have the right things been implemented, have the plans been executed. But the board itself is, I think, is really at the level more of, as you mentioned before, setting the risk appetite, but also not just necessarily only looking at the risks, but also looking at the opportunities that come with cyber. And there are a lot of discussions and decisions that need to be made at that level as well, which are completely independent from any audit question. So for example, what's the right balance between our connectivity and our dependency on third parties? So how much control, for example, how much ownership do we need over our own data versus the whole question of, do we want to go for the cheapest outsourcing solution? Because both have really strong pros and cons, and answering those kind of questions are really, really important. Of course, then it is the challenge of the organization, the senior leadership, but also to a certain extent then the audit side, to really supplement this discussion with useful numbers. So therefore really help quantifying the whole cyber discussion, because in the end, that's what it mostly comes down to. It's a financial discussion, and that's something that of course needs to be enabled. But strong roles for both for both aspects there, I think.
Okay. Troels?
Yeah, the only thing I want to mention in this context here is the reality we see in my own country, and I don't know how it is in the rest of European countries, but I think it's the same, is that 99.7% of all enterprises are small, medium enterprises with less than 250 employees. They do not have a SOC. They do not even maybe have a CISO, and I'm sure they don't have an audit committee. They might have a board, but I think that sometimes we also need to address this, and we have actually got loads of questions that we are talking above that segment. So, you know, we're talking to companies at the size of banks and whatever, and I think we need sometimes to lower to those who are the backbone of the majority of our industry and our production, and these are the small and medium enterprises, and find a way how they feel comfortable with discussing this issue and not feeling that it's so difficult that they simply, you know, just put it under the carpet or whatever, because we need them also to be safe. So I think it's also about communication, and the right level is very, very important.
Very fair point. But Klara, you're working with different types of organizations. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I just want to, you know, when it comes to the capability question that we've been discussing, you know, I mean, I think ideally, you know, the individuals that are joining the board, they have the appropriate knowledge and skills to understand and manage these risks. Obviously, that is not realistic because, again, I think boards are made of individuals who bring different sets of expertise to the table. So they may not necessarily have it. But however, for me, the key here for the board and in their responsibility, again, regardless of the size, is making sure they stay informed, that they get the regular advice from management on what's the risk exposure, what is the threat landscape, what is the regulatory landscape, and they actually should request and require and even hold some of the management people accountable for reporting in an understandable way and in a quantifiable way. I think that's another issue that a lot of the times the smaller organizations, you know, they tell me, well, okay, we outsource our IT and our cybersecurity. We get this information, but we don't understand it, to Troels' point. You know, so it really is about staying informed and actually requesting and demanding and holding management accountable to be informed in a way that you can actually understand it in the context of your board responsibility, you know, that you can quantify the risk, that you can relate it to what the organization is doing. Because if you know, if someone says, well, we had, you know, this many attempts, sorry, I just have to go back to Troels' point. You know, even the way we talk, everything is a cyber attack. Well, not everything is a cyber attack. And if you tell the board, well, we had 7 attempts on cyber attacks, I don't really know what it means. I mean, what kind of compromise, what does it mean for my business? So it's really the request to speak. I mean, this should be request from the board to the management team. Give me the information so I can talk about it. So the Global Cyber Alliance does work with a lot of small businesses, and where we really come at the problem is to say, look, you're a small business. You are trying to manage the cyber risk. You are in the supply chain of a large organization. They are telling you what to do, but you don't know how. So there's so much guidance, and I'm actually going a little bit into the execution part here. You know, there's a lot of guidance we see for small businesses, but they are not really given anything to deal with the challenge. So I think, as I talked a little bit at the beginning about the board's agility to help the supply chain to understand, you know, what the risk is, but also provide something to their supply chain or encourage the organization actually proactively manage the risk to the supply chain, especially those small businesses, in terms of providing them practical tools. There is, again, a lot of the times what I've seen is that there are given guidance, these small businesses in the supply chain of a larger organization, but they're not giving the tool. So one of the things we've done was to actually create a small business toolkit which operationalized cyber hygiene. So we looked at the top 10 cybersecurity controls from the Center for Internet Security, and we matched them with free, freely available tools. But the added value of GC8 is that we curated the tool. So a lot of the times organizations are said have two-factor authentication, but they don't even know where to go for it. So we've selected, through a technical review, the best tools kind of out there, in a free. So to me, really where the board comes into the place to say to the management of the organization, of course, third-party risk is one of the issues. Yes, you are looking at it, but during this, especially during a pandemic, how about we proactively help our small businesses in the supply chain? They will be secure. We'll come out of it as a good corporate citizen because we provided them something, that's free. And at the end of the day, they will be protected and that will protect the organization. So it's really in the execution challenge, and I'm talking about a small subset of the issues, is to think about how board can encourage the management of the organizations to do practical things for the small businesses in their chain.
Great. Now, many thanks, Klara, for actually bringing us to the third topic, the execution challenge, as you just mentioned. And probably just closing on the capability topic. Yes, we probably can't expect that we have, 7 or 9 board members with the experience of this panel here in cybersecurity, but probably can expect to have board members who know to ask the right questions. And I think that's probably will be one way to secure some of these capabilities. But now let's move to the third one, I think probably the real one. So what are some of the hurdles, challenges we have seen in actually executing a grand strategy and grand plans and KPIs and all that? What can go wrong later on? And probably Troels, you have been working with many companies, have seen many cases. What's your top 3 list of what can go wrong and how to avoid that?
No, but I think again that everything can go wrong. So the first thing I would look for is the approach in the board. Are they open-minded? I think that what we consider is that trust will be for digital, like sustainability is for production. So you need to have trust embedded in your company. If you understand that, this is also a driver that you can understand. And then of course you need to also have expertise, first of all. I realize that I'm one of the worst myself to talk tribal language. So you use all these acronyms, and then suddenly you talk with your own tribe, but nobody else understands you. I always say to a CISO when he tells me my board doesn't understand me, then you speak the wrong language, right? So we need to speak in a way that everybody can understand. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think everything is about resilience. I think I think resilience is a bit broader than just security. So in World Economic Forum, we say that cyber resilience refers to an organization's ability to prepare for, absorb, respond, adapt to, and recover from an adverse situation while continuing to function as intended. And the most advanced of this resilience can, of course, adapt to various threats. So I think, first of all, you need expertise. If you don't have expertise, you risk in the board to talk about the tree instead of the forest. And then you talk about isolated incidents that has no impact, and you get much more focused and detailed where you should stay at the strategic level. That's the first thing. The second thing is you need to have a plan. I always ask, the first thing when I go into a company is, do you have a cybersecurity strategy? Show it to me. And has it been implemented? Have you considered it at all? And does this include not just tech, but also people and processes? And not just from hacking from the outside, but also what can go wrong from the inside and from supply chain and all of that. And when you have defined that, and the board has taken the risk appetite, allocated the resources, then of course you need to create a year wheel where you put in cyber at some of the meetings, not necessarily all. Let's not overdo cyber. Cyber is just another operational risk and needs to be addressed. And if it's addressed, then it's also, part of that you can have a fire, a pandemic, or whatever can go wrong with your business, but you need to address it. So I would sum it up to these areas. And then last but not least, as Sebastian said, train, because you will be sitting in a situation at some point, and if you have already tested that on yourself according to your own plans, you know who will speak, who will say that, who will communicate to this, who will say what and whatever. Will you pay, will you not pay? Is it legal, is it illegal? You are not going to discover that during the attack, you are going to discover that before the attack. So that should be my advice.
Okay, great, thanks a lot. For Caroline, what have been the biggest hurdles you have experienced in your practice?
So to make it happen, to make it all happen, I would like to go back to the fact that of what we talked about of the comprehensive way of looking at things. The best success story within the board, with the help of the Audit Committee, but at board level, absolutely, was assessing through, well, one of the many frameworks is the NIST cybersecurity framework. Personally, I found it quite useful in making it happen because one, it is able to bring out what the previous speaker just said, people factor and technical factor. Half the problem are people, half the problem are technicalities. Within this framework, there are about 20 components. Only about half of them are the technical tools. Why do we always talk about identity and access management? Well, everybody likes to talk about that because they think they understand it, but 20 components, and every single one of those components counts. On the governance side, it's your policies, your metrics, your strategy that we talked about, prioritizing, and so forth, and your organization. On the prevention side, there's many tools of architecture, of asset management, data protection, host security, and so forth. But the detection side, threat intelligence, I remember one case where everything was pretty good, pretty well set of these 20 components, but threat intelligence was very low. Well, guess what? That compromised the entire framework. Why was it low? It was a problem of capabilities, problem of resources. And so that is where, in fact, the budget went to, was increasing threat intelligence. And then making it happen is also, in that comprehensive viewpoint, the response capability. I have lots of war stories on crisis management, and that's what was just mentioned about the two companies, Target and Home Depot. One was good at response capability and the other wasn't, and made all the difference in the world on the reputational impact. So communication strategy, recovery tactics, incident response is another area, people factor and tools factor, that count so much in making it happen right. We mentioned also the importance of board risk appetite. That's why discussion should take place during at least once within the long-term and strategy planning. That's where your risk appetite can come out if you're ready to do that. Risk appetite can be qualitative. Risk appetite can be with a bit of scenario analyses, also quantitative. It can be produced at cyber level. And in fact, there's a very interesting example placed in the guidance, if I may. It's a qualitative statement, but it was fascinating within the ecoDa guidance. The organization actually came out, it's a true story, saying, we have a tolerance for risk to achieve business objectives, but we have a rather low risk appetite for the loss of business and customer data. Okay, priority on customer data. We have a medium risk appetite for physical information security assets, but we track the assets greater than a certain amount, and we classify our assets based on a data classification framework. Medium risk level. And we have a medium high risk level for access controls, which floored me, but they qualify that with the fact that they access organization mission critical systems to be controlled by a certain biometric authentication and so forth. But it was a well put out qualitative statement. Whoever's ready for that, I encourage qualitative statements. The metrics, which we talked about, metrics, financial metrics, non-financial metrics, here we go. What should the board be receiving? Okay, we talk about budgets. Losses incurred, in a bank, losses incurred also related to cyber are regular. The number of incidents, the amount of downtime that occurred in a small or a large incident, customer satisfaction, whether it comes through from an incident or from a survey with relation to their comfort in the bank's or other entities' response to cyber. So these are just a few examples of how to make it happen.
Very good point about the metrics, and probably this also brings us to one question which just came in from a participant, who asked a very pragmatic and practical question: how can I actually assess the magnitude of risks my company faces? How can I do an initial assessment to determine how much we should invest into the topic? I'm not sure, Sebastian, I'd like to take this.
I can actually come with a very tangible example on what actually AIG is offering in this particular context, because of course it's also a question that we ask ourselves all the time when it comes to a little bit of a different perspective, of course, how much money might be at risk. But there are quite a few very good methodologies out there, and AIG has one, for example, that really helps you quantify the risk, understanding what's your dependency on the digital world when it comes to your business operations, what is the current threat landscape out there, all the way over to which security controls are in place and what's your unmitigated risk. And then using that as a starting point to quantitatively model scenarios like what's the data breach scenario, what's the business interruption scenario, even ransomware cases scenario, to really then give you very particular and dedicated numbers for your business that you can then use as a starting point for your own risk management for follow-on discussions. So that would be my suggestion. Really have that discussion, for example, with an insurer, because we look at it. We look at the same question.
Okay, great. Troels, what's your take on that?
I think it's a great question, because you always start to look, do I actually spend enough? Do I spend too much, too little? What does my peers spend? And is that also the right level to actually measure you against, or should you do that individually? I can tell you that the majority of big companies, they do it in the following way. They first identify what is our crown jewels, what is it that you don't want to lose. And that is, of course, different. If you're a bank, then it might be money, credit card information, SWIFT information, whatever. If you're at a different company, it's something different. But you need to identify your crown jewels. When you know that, you do as Carolyn said, you identify your threat landscape, right? Your risk landscape. Who is the adversaries that might be interested in stealing that from you or blackmailing that from you? What are their motives and what are their tools? When you know that, you go back to your own organization and say, what kind of controls do we already have now, and where, and the CISO will know, are our known vulnerabilities. Based on that picture now, you can set your risk appetite. And you can say, okay, I'll live with this, that there is this risk, because we cannot make 100% security. Forget about that. That's too expensive, too cumbersome. That will not work. It doesn't work in the physical world and will not work here. So we have to make this risk assessment. And I think that is the only way you can do it, by making these various assessments. And then last but not least, on the internet, you can find calculators. So if you want to assess what is the cost of a breach from ransomware or DDoS attack, if you have an organization with 1,000 employees, they cost so much, they are so dependent, you put this in and you can see clearly what it will cost you to have downtime. And that is only the financial cost. That is not the reputational cost. And then you can, of course, then say, okay, should I then maybe perhaps mitigate a bit more based on that cost here? Because a CFO, he likes to see numbers. He doesn't want to hear about your gut feeling. He wants to hear numbers. What can this risk be? And I think that could be one of the ways.
Okay, great, thanks. Probably another great question from the audience. Somebody points out that these days businesses are much more interdependent. We have very integrated supply chains. So how to make sure as a board to have transparency of the cyber risks throughout supply chains? Probably Sebastian, would like to take this one?
Sure. From my perspective, there are a few vehicles that can be very useful. And the first one is really on the contractual side. So if you want to get visibility into your cyber risks within your supply chain, you really need to look at it from a contractual perspective. So putting the right requirements into your contract, having the right service level agreements in place, requiring the right certifications with your suppliers, and so on. And I've seen that it is very useful to kind of avoid David versus Goliath scenarios where you as a small, manufacturing company try to then negotiate a contract with the big Amazons and Microsofts of the world. That doesn't really work. But if you find a more regional player, then you have much more capabilities there to kind of put your requirements actually into the contract. The second aspect is audit, to really have audit capabilities. And then the third aspect is more on the technical side, really trying to maybe use a third-party supplier, but stay in control of your own data as much as possible. And then when it comes, of course, to the board aspect of that question, kind of goes back to what I mentioned before a little bit. It's not so much the technical questions that need to be answered here, or which technical controls need to be put in the contracts, but more the risk appetite discussion. What is it that we even want to consider for outsourcing? Are we considering outsourcing going to the cheapest, even though they're sitting maybe in parts of the world where there's the political situation is unstable, or are we willing to spend more money and therefore have, for example, more control over our data, or more trust in how our data is being handled? So it's that discussion basically that needs to happen.
Excellent. So actually, as the hour is up soon, I just probably would like to have a brief final round, asking each of you, what would be your key takeaway, your key recommendation to a board member who tries to put cyber risk on the agenda in his next meeting? What should she or he do, and how can he drive this topic effectively and efficiently? Probably, Klara, would you like to start?
Sure, it's always the easy. I mean, I think we had a good round of recommendations, but I think the three things to me is, create the culture, stay informed, understand what are the organizational risks, really adopt that kind of impact tolerance mindset to understand, what is your risk tolerance. And then when it comes to supply chain, really think about what the organization can do to practically help beyond contractual requirements, beyond the assurance programs. What can you do practically to help your supply chain, specifically during these times, because the small organizations do not have the resources and you do need them in your supply chain. So those are, I would say, three things.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Troels?
I concur with Klara. I think that we have summed it up. I think it's, I would look at to get a real update from my experts in a language I can understand. Based on this, I would look at the basics. I think everything should be risk-driven. And I think there's so much hype also in this environment that you tend to think that there is a Russian or a Chinese spy behind every stone that you face. And I don't think that's true. I think that you can actually do a lot by starting by implementing the basics. And if you do that, you get rid of 80% of your problems. So I would say cyber hygiene is the same for cybersecurity as social distancing is for Corona. It will not, prevent us from getting infected, but it will lower the risk, and that's the same. So I would do that very much, unless I was, the chief for Lockheed Martin or somebody else who is in the crosshairs of these guys. I would look at the basics and get informed in a language I understand.
Okay, great.
Sorry, Michael, I just have either a quick round at the end or just after Troels, if I have
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was just about the cyber hygiene point. That is the point where GCA works, is to operationalize cyber hygiene at scale. And we do know that it's been measured that, the top 10 CIS controls address about 80% of risk. The problem is that if we don't have the expertise, we're always going to go for the big and shiny and expensive. And again, that is not necessarily how you build the baseline resilience, because the baseline resilience is actually, if you're informed and you know what to do, then it's actually relatively easy to build that. So just a second, the cyber hygiene point, that should be the starting point. Apologies, Caroline.
Okay.
Oh, no problem.
Caroline, what's your takeaways?
Just wanted to mention, because we've said everything succinctly. The ecoDa guidance is very good. Look at the questions and pick the ones you like. One thing is knowledge. Another thing is comfort at board level. I would like to mention that I almost always utilize at least once, internal audit to do an end-to-end process review that will capture that supplier transparency, the vulnerabilities, external and internal, as far as cyber comes from. I've had some good experience on that side for gaining knowledge and comfort.
Okay, great. Sebastian, your final word.
Sure. From my perspective, maybe 3 points on the soft skills side. First one is really empower yourself as a board member or as a board. So really study the topic, invite expertise onto the topic to really become more knowledgeable, but then also kind of embrace the unknown. Because you're sitting on the board for a reason. You're an experienced business leader. You certainly have the expertise and the skills. So kind of coming back a little bit to what Caroline mentioned before, kind of develop a gut feeling for the right questions to ask when it comes to cyber. And then maybe as a closing point, kind of challenge your executive team when it comes to cyber. Are they doing the right things? Do they know enough? Or are there points of improvement? And from a personal perspective, one thing maybe always a good discussion starter is, what's the actually strategic position of the CISO in the organization? Should it be under the CIO, under the CFO, under the CRO, or should it be a top level position? That discussion, I think, alone really allows a lot of facets to be covered when it comes to cyber.
Great. No, thanks a lot. I think I would like to thank all of you a lot for you very rich, sharing your rich experience with us. Again, we didn't have time to discuss all the dimensions and elements. It's a very fascinating topic, but at least I think we have a couple of questions we can think about, when we go back to our boards and try to put it on the agenda. I also would like to thank ecoDa-AIG for making this webinar possible. And last but not least, thank all the participants for your valuable time, your great questions. And if you like to learn more about this topic, about the panelists, please go to ecoda.org. And you also will receive an email with some further information and links to some very practical tools you can use to make this a key topic in your boards. With that, I'd like to thank all of you and wish you all a successful personal and professional cybersecurity journey. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.